The heavy iron door groaned as it swung shut, cutting off the humid Alabama air and the distant murmur of the city. Clarence B. Jones stepped into the corridor. The light here was thin and gray, filtered through layers of dust and time. Every footfall on the concrete floor echoed, a sharp, rhythmic sound that seemed to vibrate against the damp walls. He gripped his briefcase tighter, feeling the weight of the papers inside pressing against his palm. He walked past the rows of cells, each one a stark cage of vertical steel, casting long, jagged shadows across the walkway that sliced the floor into dark segments. The air smelled of cold stone and confinement. He reached the end of the hall and stopped. A single, heavy gate stood between him and the man who held the conscience of a nation. Behind the bars, Martin Luther King Jr. sat at a small, scarred wooden table. The steel bars stood as a silent, immovable barrier between them, separating the world outside from the quiet, urgent intensity of the cell. Jones adjusted his grip on the handle, took a steadying breath, and waited for the guard to turn the key. The lock clicked open. The meeting had begun. The guard retreated, leaving them in the hollow quiet of the cell. Jones placed his briefcase on the table and clicked the latches open. He pulled out a stack of yellow legal pads and a fountain pen, sliding them across the scarred surface toward King. King did not hesitate. He began to speak, the words emerging with a steady, relentless cadence that filled the small space. Jones bent over the paper, his hand moving in rapid, rhythmic strokes to keep pace. Every line he etched recorded a demand for justice that echoed against the damp masonry. King leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the empty air as he shaped the arguments that would dismantle the silence of the moderates. The scratch of the nib against the paper became the only sound in the room. When King paused to gather a thought, Jones did not wait. He organized the previous sentences, refining the structure, turning raw emotion into a precise, legal weapon. They worked in a tight, synchronized loop. Sheet after sheet of yellow paper filled with dark ink, stacking up like a fortification against the injustice outside these walls. The intensity of their task stripped away the reality of the bars. They were not in a cell. They were building a manifesto. Jones flipped the final page, his wrist aching, and looked up. The document was ready. Jones gathered the yellow sheets, his movements sharp and deliberate. He stacked them, tapped the edges against the table to align them, and then slid the bundle toward himself. Outside the cell, heavy boots rhythmically struck the concrete floor. The sound grew louder, signaling the guard's return. Jones did not panic. He stood up, keeping his body between the guard's line of sight and the table. He tucked the stack of papers beneath his layers, pressing them firmly against his side. The edges felt sharp, a hidden weight that changed the way he stood. He held his breath as the guard paused at the bars, the keys jingling with a metallic, jarring resonance. The guard squinted into the dim light, glancing at the empty table, then at Jones. Jones remained still, his face a mask of calculated indifference. He moved toward the gate with measured, steady steps, every fiber of his being focused on keeping the papers from shifting. The gate creaked open. He stepped into the corridor, heart hammering against his ribs, and walked toward the exit. The guard did not stop him. He reached the main entrance, pushed through the heavy doors, and felt the sudden blast of heat from the Alabama afternoon. He was out. The manifesto was safe. The heat of the street offered no relief from the cold reality of the courts. Jones reached his office, but there was no time to rest. A messenger waited with a summons, a fresh injunction designed to cripple the marches by dawn. He scanned the document, eyes darting across the dense, restrictive language. The threat was clear. Stop the movement or face total suppression. Jones did not hesitate. He cleared his desk, spread out his own legal pads, and began to draft a counter-motion. He worked with the precision of a surgeon, citing precedents and filing briefs that challenged the authority of the local magistrates. Every hour was a race against the clock. He navigated the bureaucracy, filing motions that forced the courts to acknowledge their demands. He turned the system against itself, using every loophole and legal requirement to keep the protesters on the streets. When the judge reviewed his filings, the injunction was stayed. The movement remained legal, protected by the very laws the opposition tried to use as a weapon. Jones leaned back in his chair, his hands stained with ink. watching the sun rise. The legal shield held. He had successfully bought them another day, another march, and another chance to challenge the established order through the weight of the law. The hotel room was a small, airless box. Outside, the city hummed with the anticipation of the march, but inside, the silence was heavy. Jones sat at a desk cluttered with coffee cups and scattered notes. Across from him, Martin Luther King Jr. held the drafted speech. The pages were neatly typed, the arguments logical, the structure sound. King began to read aloud, his voice low and steady. Jones listened, tracking the cadence. He watched King's eyes scan the lines. They reached the end of the second page. King paused. He looked up, his expression unreadable. The words were there, but the fire was missing. They sat in the dim light, the hum of the city filtering through the thin glass of the window. Jones leaned forward, his elbows on the table. He looked at the paper, then at King. He felt the weight of the thousands waiting in the streets, the millions watching from afar. This document was a legal briefing, not a call to history. He saw King tap the corner of the paper, a sharp, rhythmic motion. The tension tightened like a coiled spring. They were standing on the precipice of a defining moment, and the prepared draft was nothing more than a barrier between them and the truth. Jones stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked to the window and looked out at the city streets, then turned back to the table. He pointed a finger at the typed pages. "Martin, put it down. Forget the text." The air in the room seemed to thin. King looked at him, startled, his hands still resting on the prepared draft. The silence stretched, measured by the ticking of a clock on the wall. Jones moved closer, his voice dropping to a low, steady command. "The people do not need a legal brief. They need to hear the truth of what you believe." King hesitated. He stared at the ink-stained lines that had taken hours to perfect. He looked at the window, then back to the desk. With a sharp, sudden motion, he pushed the stack of papers across the wooden surface. They slid until they hit the edge, scattering slightly. The desk was empty now. King leaned back, his gaze fixed on the wall, his jaw set. The weight of the moment held them both still. Everything they had prepared was gone. Only the voice remained. The room felt smaller, the pressure mounting as they waited for the words that would define a generation. King stood. He did not look at the discarded papers. He stepped out of the room and toward the podium, his movements deliberate and unburdened. Jones followed, watching the horizon where the crowd stretched into the distance like an ocean of waiting souls. King reached the microphone. He stood for a heartbeat, his eyes scanning the sea of faces. Then he began to speak. It was not the drafted prose. It was a rhythm, a cadence pulled from the depth of his conviction. "I have a dream," he said. The words hit the air and the atmosphere shifted. The crowd did not just listen, they responded. A ripple moved through the tens of thousands in front of the Lincoln Memorial. A sound rose, a collective roar of recognition and raw energy that shook the very ground. Jones stood just behind the line of sight, watching the faces of those nearest the stage. They were no longer a static mass. They were alive, swaying, shouting, reaching toward the dais. The unscripted truth had pierced the air, and in that instant, the silence of the past was shattered by a tidal wave of hope. Every person on the mall leaned forward, tethered to the sound of his voice, as the dream began to take root in the hearts of the nation. Jones remained in the shadows of the podium, his posture rigid. He watched the thousands of people shift and surge, a living landscape of protest. He looked down at his own hands, calloused and steady. He thought of the courtrooms, the sterile judges' chambers, and the endless stacks of legal briefs he had filed to secure this very gathering. Every permit he had fought for, every injunction he had challenged, and every motion he had argued in the face of local hostility formed the invisible structure beneath the stage. Without those filings, the police barricades would have closed this space hours ago. Without that legal protection, this momentum would have been dismantled by the bureaucracy of the state. He saw the crowd not just as a movement of voices, but as a victory of procedure. The law had been his shield, a series of calculated steps that allowed this moment to exist in the open air. He gripped the edge of the wooden platform, feeling the vibration of the thousands of feet striking the ground in unison. It was a rhythmic, solid thrum. He had laid the bricks, one by one, through long nights of drafting, and now, the structure he built was holding the weight of a nation. The dream was finally standing on the foundation he had carved into the bedrock of the law. Decades later, the air inside the archives was still and cool. Jones walked the narrow aisles between towering shelves, his footsteps muffled by the industrial carpet. He stopped at a specific row, his eyes scanning the labels until he found the crate marked with the year 1963. He pulled the lid back, the sound of cardboard scraping against cardboard echoing in the quiet. He reached in and drew out the stack of yellow legal pads. They were brittle now, the edges softened by time, but the ink remained dark and legible. He ran his thumb over the indentations where the pen had pressed through the paper. These were not just notes. These were the raw drafts of a movement, written in the cramped, hurried script of a cell. He turned a page, seeing his own shorthand notations in the margins, the strategic reminders, and the legal citations he had woven into the text. The weight of the pad in his palm brought the past into the present. He traced a line of text, the dry paper rasping against his skin. This was the tangible evidence of the long, calculated fight. Every mark on these pages had once been a wall he was tasked to break, and holding them now, he felt the heavy, quiet gravity of the history he had personally helped to shape. He set the legal pads back into their box and closed the lid, the soft click of the latch signaling the end of his review. Outside the archive building, the city moved in a steady, modern rhythm. Jones stepped onto the sidewalk and walked with the same measured stride he had used for decades. His life had been a series of precise, disciplined actions, each one a calculated strike against the walls of segregation. He did not seek the glare of the spotlight. He preferred the quiet rooms where the real work was done, the drafting of motions, the filing of injunctions, and the careful navigation of court procedures that turned abstract justice into legal reality. He looked at the buildings around him, seeing the city not as it was, but as a space he had helped reshape through the slow, grinding pressure of the law. Every document he had signed, every motion he had argued, and every strategy he had forged acted as a structural support for the equality that followed. He was the silent architect. He had built the framework that allowed the movement to survive the storms of history, ensuring the foundation remained intact for those who would walk on it later. He turned the corner, disappearing into the flow of the crowd, his work long ago woven into the bedrock of the nation.